Let's talk context for Unit 2, 1607 to 1754. Look at all the pretty colors. Here's North America in 1754, and all those colonies represent different European powers. The French in that kind of peach or tan, the British in the dark purple, the Spanish in the green, way over there in the orange, unorganized, unclaimed as of yet, but you even have Russian settlers in that area. North America is for the taking as far as Europe is concerned by 1754 still. So we're going to talk about the other empires in North America at this time. That includes New Spain. And when I think of New Spain, I think control, convert, and exploit through things like the mission system and the encomienda system, where the Spanish are trying to control the land as other powers are trying to take it and control the Native American population, to convert them to Catholicism, as they will be easier to control if they are also good Catholics, and exploit them through their labor. The encomenderos abused and used the Native Americans for their labor. We're going to talk about New France, the French colonies in North America. And when I think of New France, I think of alliances, I think of trade, and I think of their missionaries and how they were different than the Spanish. The French, from early on, are more interested in making a profit in the New World from trade with Native Americans, as opposed to taking land and settling on their own and farming that land or for some other reason. So as a result, from early on, they fostered better relationships with Native Americans. And their missionaries followed that model as well. Rather than summoning the Native Americans to live with them at the mission, the French missionaries went out and lived among the Native American tribes. We'll also be talking about the Dutch colonies in the New World. New Netherlands is the most prominent, with the city of New Amsterdam, which was built roughly where Manhattan is today. And the Dutch were driven by capitalism. Remember, at this time, the Dutch had the largest merchant fleet in the world, and their colony is going to follow the lead of their home country and be both very tolerant and focused on trade. The Netherlands at the time were a safe haven for many people of a refuge for many people of religious wars across Europe. The Netherlands itself had fought a religious war to break away from Catholic Spain and drive the Spanish out. And as a result of that tolerance, the New Amsterdam colony, New Netherlands colony is going to be very, very diverse. You have people from all parts of Europe and even some parts of Africa settling in New Amsterdam. The English colonies that we're going to talk about, the 13 colonies, can be grouped into 3 or 4 different categories. I like to use 4 categories or 4 regions. And the first one that we'll talk about is the Chesapeake region. And when I think about the Chesapeake region, I think about a capitalistic struggle, because Jamestown, settled in 1607, and the subsequent Virginia colony all around it, was founded by a private company to make a profit. And it really, really struggles. It's near collapse. They turn to cannibalism at one point, it's so bad, before the introduction of what we see here, and that's the tobacco crop, which makes Virginia into a profitable colony. They're going to come to rely on indentured servants and later slaves. We're going to see a growing division in the Chesapeake between the coastal, wealthy, large land-owning elites and the frontier colonists who are fighting and scrapping for what's left. We're also going to talk about Maryland, created in the same region, has a lot of the same economic characteristics as Virginia, but Maryland is founded as a Catholic haven. Remember, England was a Protestant country. Being a Catholic in England could result in discrimination and prejudice. So a prominent Catholic noble purchased the land in Maryland to create a Catholic safe haven, but they're still going to need Protestants to settle there, which leads to some division and violence. We'll move on from the Chesapeake and talk about New England after that. And when I think of the New England colonies, I think of that religious drive that was the focus of so much of what they did. Plymouth, founded in 1620, and Massachusetts Bay in 1628, both by religious dissenters, people who were upset with the national church in England, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. They were dissatisfied with it for a variety of reasons. And as a result, you have a very different sort of migration. Whereas you had single white men migrating to Virginia, in New England you have whole families, whole communities packing up and migrating, sometimes leaving their whole village behind and building a new town in Massachusetts or Connecticut or later Rhode Island. As a result, you have a much more equitable division of wealth in these New England towns because there's a collective drive to succeed as a community. Not because that was their goal, because they were worried if they were to fail as a community, it would reflect poorly on God. You have some subsistence farming, you have some fishing, you later have some shipping, and then related industries related to shipping that are going to be the backbone of the economy in this region. It's important to remember that we don't have theocracies in New England. There are town elections, and ministers were often barred from holding public office. But it's also important to remember that this is not a land of religious freedom. The Pilgrims who settled in Plymouth, the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts Bay, came to the New World to worship their way. They did not welcome any dissent. In fact, Rhode Island was founded by people kicked out of Massachusetts for disagreeing with the Puritan leaders of Massachusetts Bay. We'll move on from New England to talk next about the middle colonies. This is New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And probably we'll start with Pennsylvania, which is created as a religious refuge, not for Catholics like Maryland, but for Quakers, a minority sect of Protestants in Great Britain who were heavily persecuted. The Quakers, unlike the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, extended religious freedom to others that settled in the area. So, like New Amsterdam, which is eventually going to become New York and become part of the British colonies, there's a lot of diversity in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia as well. New York, when it is added to the British Empire, maintains a lot of the Dutch sensibilities and characteristics that focus on trade and that tolerance for others. This region has a very diverse economy. You have Philadelphia and New York as major trade hubs and very cosmopolitan cities, while the countryside, western Pennsylvania, upstate New York, really are the breadbasket of the colonies. They're the ones growing the vast majority of corn, wheat, and barley. We'll finish up by looking at the southern colonies, or the Deep South. And when we talk about that, we're talking about South Carolina. We're talking about kind of the southern part of North Carolina. Northern North Carolina is more like Virginia. And we're including Georgia in that as well. This region's settlement begins with what's called Charlestown, later changed to Charleston in South Carolina. It was created through land deeded by Charles II to his friends, to his loyal supporters, to royalists. And really, South Carolina and parts of North Carolina and Georgia are really only economically successful after the introduction of slave labor and the plantation system, which comes to the American colonies by way of another British colony in the Caribbean, Barbados. Here in the Deep South, we have an even more dramatic difference in wealth. You have even fewer middle-class whites than in the Chesapeake. Georgia has an interesting history. It was actually begun as a haven for debtors, people who had been thrown in prison for going into debt. And like I said, Georgia is going to flounder and not really be successful until they allow slavery and plantation systems to take place or take hold. We're also going to talk in Unit 2 about exchanges with Britain and how our American interactions with Great Britain develop American ties with the home country of Britain. There are commercial ties that are built. And that's, a big result of the mercantilist system that's put in place and enforced through something called the Navigation Acts, which required the American colonies to only trade with England. We're going to talk about religious interactions, things like the First Great Awakening, which was a religious movement on both sides of the Atlantic taking place in England and in the New World. It's when relatively new Protestant sects like Methodism, John Wesley's interpretation of Protestant Christianity, takes hold, first in England, and then that's brought to the New World as well. We're going to talk about philosophical exchanges or interactions with Britain. The Enlightenment, we talk a lot in world studies about the French philosophers like Rousseau and Montesquieu, but let's not forget John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. These ideas, published, written, shared in England, are shared over here in the New World as well, especially in places like Philadelphia. And we'll talk about political exchanges. And this was the system under which most of the colonies were ruled. Up above, you have the British Crown, and the Crown chose, or at least approved, a royal governor. And the royal governor had his council. That was normally rich, wealthy, privileged elites from either America or Britain. And then you have the colonial assembly, those people chosen by the voting class in America who would propose legislation. However, these exchanges with Britain do not only foster ties with Britain, but they begin to build an American identity as well and start to draw some distinctions, some lines between the American colonists and the British home country. For example, when we talk about political interactions, the American colonists are really going to emphasize the importance of the colonial assembly. However, from the British perspective, the colonial assembly is the least important. That's going to create some divisions. When we talk about the philosophical interactions, we're not just going to talk about salons in France. We're going to talk about these guys, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, who considered themselves children of the Enlightenment, scholars of the Enlightenment. The ideas in the Declaration of Independence are Enlightenment ideas. We're going to use those Enlightenment ideas, we, the Americans, are going to use those to break away from Britain. And when we talk about religious movements, we'll talk about the First Great Awakening. It also includes some growing division between Americans and English religion. It's going to include even stronger separation from the Anglican Church. It's going to really affirm that congregationalism that had become popular in New England, where you really have local rule of the church. And when we talk about commercial ties, we're going to talk about these guys, New England merchants, growing in power, because they're not, even though the Navigation Acts told them to, they're not just trading with Britain. They're smuggling goods from the Dutch and from the French and building a uniquely American economy. And when we talk about exchanges with Britain, we're not going to forget the importance of slavery and how slavery developed in these American colonies and the distinctive nature that slavery took on within different regions. While slavery was practiced in all 13 original colonies, it looked very, very different in South Carolina as opposed to, say, in Massachusetts. That's the context for Unit 2. Good luck.